Hi, thank you. Yes, this is UI Testing is Ruff. Hound can help. I'm Vanessa Lee. I am part of Interline Vacations, senior developer. We have offices in the UK, the US, and Canada. I'm based in Austin, Texas, and we have a very small team. We have 2 seniors, 2 juniors, but we've been working in the ecosystem for nearly a decade. But my academic background is in children's literature. And there is one thing in particular I appreciate about code over literature, and that is that with code, you usually know if it works or not. And if you apply that to literature, you get into more imprecise things like feelings and opinions. So I tend to appreciate that code is testable, but that doesn't mean that code is easy to test. So for example, we're in the travel industry, and a little bit ago we had a bug report from an agent who was selling cruises through one of our longest running Erlang applications. It's a cruise API. It talks to a bunch of different cruise lines and books itineraries. The agent said, there is one customer I cannot book a cruise for. Every other customer's fine, just this one customer. So we research and find out it's the birth year. Apparently, for this particular cruise line, on this particular itinerary, if you were born in 1941, you are not welcome. And that was not my bug, right? Which is nice to find out, but it did get me thinking, because at the time I was writing a Phoenix app, a credit card processing app. I did not want a 1941 bug when I was dealing with money. But when it came time to do end-user testing, I did not want to do it by hand. And it was because of the sheer volume of the tests. As I mentioned, we have 3 companies. They each have a separate relationship with a bank. And then we have different product lines, and we have different input fields for different transactions, and they're different for each of the companies. And then the banks themselves have hundreds of response codes. Like for each field, the CVV, the postal code, you're going to have these tests that you have to run against, whether you can receive this code and respond correctly. So I wanted help. And as I mentioned, we're a small team, and we do not have a dedicated QA team. So it's our tiny team plus an even smaller DevOps team, and we have to do end-to-end testing for all our products, and frankly, we're not good at it. And there's a lot of different reasons that we're not good at it. So I went to look for help, and I found Hound. And I know that Chris Keithley is here at the conference, and I was looking for sunglasses in the audience to see if he was here. But I chose Hound over Wallaby for really, I think, because it's a slightly more explicit language, and I kind of respond to that in documentation when I'm learning something new. So there is no commentary here on Wallaby over Hound. It's just this one spoke to me in the moment for the problem I was solving. So taking that with us forward, I can say, though, that browser automation testing saved me weeks of certification testing with these banks. And now they're part of my XUnit tests. So anytime I make a change to my credit card app, I run my tests, and the peace of mind is lovely. So why browser automation? So end-user tests should replicate the behavior of an actual user. And so in this case, we're talking about entering inputs, clicking things, waiting for responses. And so to demonstrate the value of that kind of testing for you, I put together a small demonstration app that is basically credit card form. So we're going to have a basic credit card form to use to demonstrate. And setup is really simple. Once it's configured, as I said, it's going to run with your XUnit tests. And you will need a WebDriver server running. And I'm on Mac, so it was really easy to just brew install Selenium and run it really quickly. And then create a Phoenix app, add Hound as a dependency, and then start Hound in the test helpers file with application ensure all started Hound. and ensure that the server is started when you run your tests, because by default in text.exs, server is false. So you just change that to true. Configure your Hound, and in this case, I'm setting Selenium as my driver. And you can change that. We're going to see a little later on how even if you set up this config, you can alter it for different tests. And then run the test. It's quite simple, and it's always good to feel really quickly like a level of success when you start using a new library. And here's where the magic happens. It's in the test directory, in the _web directory. I created an acceptance directory where I'm going to keep my screenshots, because by default they go to the root, and if you're not careful, you push them up to your repo, and it's really obvious to everybody else on your team, and especially if you run hundreds of tests. So you can create a directory and send it specifically to a directory. And then we have 3 different tests we're going to look at today, and they increase in complexity. So starting out, though, it's really simple, and they all share these very simple beginnings, which is to import the Hound helpers and start the Hound session. You can also explicitly start and stop the session, but Hound session will start and destroy itself. Hound has a lot of helpers. We don't have a lot of time to look at all of them, so I'm going to focus on 5 of them today, having to do with navigation, page, element, JavaScript, screenshot. And I thought we would harken back to my academic days, and to help us chart our progress through the complexity of these tests, we'll use reading levels. So if you were educated in the US, you probably had reading levels in your school, and they were often sort of euphemistically given color names or something to help you not be embarrassed to your peers. But it will help us. We'll take the good parts of it and sort of chart our progress through Hound, and we'll start simple. We'll start with a picture book. And that level of difficulty is more focused on the basics. So we're going to look at a welcome test that just makes sure that things look the way they should. So here's my form, really simple, sort of the bare bones you would need to charge a credit card. And we're going to run a welcome test that looks for things being the way they should. So we start with importing the helpers, starting the session, and then we have a helper that navigates to a URL. And it has an optional number of retries. Here I'm handing it a URL that I got through a router helper, looking at the index page. And then Hound will take me to that URL. Now I can look at the page title. I have a helper for looking at the page title and comparing it to what I expect it to be. And then the one I find most useful and use most often in my tests is find element. Find element accepts a strategy and a selector and an optional number of retries. In this case, I'm using the strategy of ID. So Hound is going to go on, look at my page to try to find an ID that equals welcome. In this case, it's an H1 tag that equals welcome. There are other strategies I'll explain a little bit later. And then I can check the visible text of that element and make sure that it equals what I hope it equals. In this case, my H1, the visible text is St. Bernard, the safe payment system. So I would get a success message on this one. But let's move on. We're going to move up in a reading level. Now we're an early reader. Now we know the words and the pictures, but we have more action. So let's make our form perform some actions. But before we do, I admitted earlier we're not great at testing. And here's an example of why we are not great at testing. It's hard to come up with valid and invalid inputs. And when I say that it's hard, I mean that I'm just really bad at it because I know what's going to work and what should fail. What I don't know is what is going to get me. So I am posting this vulnerability right here because later we're going to have a mea culpa moment and hopefully improve upon it. So let us perform some tests that actually perform some actions, that make something happen on this page. We're going to go bit by bit, but another reminder of what the form looks like. And then let's dive in. We have familiar things. We import the helpers, we start the session, and now we're going to make sure that valid inputs yield a success message. So we navigate to the page we want. We find the element that is the form. And now Hound gives us a way to narrow that scope. So we found an element. Now we're going to find an element within that element using find within. So I'm going to find within my form element using the strategy ID that equals payment name, an input field. And I'm going to fill that field with a value from my lovely constants file. And down below that is an example of an XPath strategy. So you can use name, XPath, ID, tag, name, you get a couple different options. Now, I think I saw someone wearing an Ember shirt. Or no, it was in a talk somebody was demonstrating. They had Ember shirts on historically. We use Ember. Ember is part of our stack, and I know other JavaScript frameworks sort of hijack the ID from you, so you can't really use something as reliable as an ID. So XPath has been helpful in testing our Ember apps. Another drawback, Hound cannot give a value to an select option list. So you can, however, use JavaScript. So I can find that select option list and have JavaScript select a value or input a value to that. And I can use the execute script helper to do that. Now, if we move on, we can actually see some action, which is click. So Hound will execute, as a user would, a click on the submit button. And there I get to take a screenshot. In this case, my screenshot is going to happen every time the test is run. You could also run it only on failure, or make yourself feel good and see all the successful passing tests. There's a lot of different uses. And element displayed. This is a match function, and we're going to see a few more of those later in the talk. But it's a nice way to, I know that there is an alert that should appear on my page whether it has succeeded or failed. So I can also just make sure that that alert has loaded, because I know no matter what has happened, the alert should be there. So I can ask Hound to make sure that that element is displayed. And here you can see I'm not passing it an element. I'm passing a tuple that includes the strategy and the selector. So you'll see in our other match function, it's very similar. And then I can check the inner HTML of that element as well. That's going to grab, similar to visible text, this is just going to grab the inner HTML of that element. Here's an example of a successful screenshot from a payment that took some input values from our constant file, and it was success. But it was a success because I knew those would pass, right? So let's move on up in our chapter book here, or in our reading levels to a chapter book. Now, chapter books, you've got it down. You can read the words, you can read the pictures, but now you're ready for something a bit more sophisticated. The plot gets a little more complicated. So let's dive deeper. And I mentioned you can start the session manually, start session and end session, and you can do this in your setup and teardown. I've actually made use of it in individual tests in a file. I can start and stop. You also have the ability to change the session mid-test if you want to change it to something else. Now, you also can pass options in this case. So you can name the browser, the user agent, metadata, and driver, and the driver value is going to get passed right through to whatever WebDriver you have running. This was particularly useful for me for a couple of different reasons. JavaScript is not enabled by default, so you can enable it here by sending that in the driver information. But also, as I mentioned, 3 companies. Those companies we validate in a plug in most of our apps that does a level of authentication. I could then write one test and loop through them and change the session for each of my companies. So it was really efficient to read once I stepped away from it and came back. And another thing we can go deeper in is that Hound is fast, and it's really fun to watch it, right? It's fun to watch the browser pop, and it goes through, and it's really satisfying. But sometimes it's too fast. And especially if you have a single-page app that has to wait for something to load or to respond to a user action, sometimes you'll be tempted to use time or sleep to sort of make everything wait. But the more tests you write, the more time you're wasting waiting, and they end up taking a long time to run. I found that using Hound match functions can sometimes help with that. So I will only ask my timer to wait if something isn't visible. So I can loop through that question, is this visible or not, before I wait a little longer for it to be visible. And there's a couple different ways to do that. You can ask if there is this element at all is found, if it's visible in the page, or if it's visible within an element. And this is where you see the tuple at work again, where I can, on the third one, on visible in element, I'm passing a way to identify that element with the tuple. And then also some regex pattern matching. And here's a few other helpers that I found useful. You can look at the page source, refresh the page, check current URL. Now, the current URL has come in really helpful for me because our stack is crazy diverse, right? I mentioned Ember, but our legacy app is PHP, and that PHP app is going to go out to different apps to authenticate, to book a resort, to book a cruise, to find a customer. But I can test that whole process and check my URL along the way as one of the ways to figure out when something has gone wrong. So it's really been helpful. And you can find elements, all of them. In this case, find all the paragraph tags. You get an array back that you can work with. Check if something has a class. Now this one I haven't tried yet. I haven't had a reason to, but I really want to find a reason to because I just think it's cool that you can find an element sort of relative to where the X and Y axis are. And you can send keys. If a user would perform a particular keystroke, Hound can do that for you too. You can also run JavaScript asynchronously, or as I mentioned earlier, change your session. So you've got your session started, you can also change it to something else and pass along those options. You just have to give it a name. So, up to this point, the demonstration has been rife with horrible, valid, invalid data examples, right? So I told you the mea culpa was coming. And this is it. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, though. We don't want to ban all tests just because we're not good at coming up with input values. So let's force ourselves to get a little better. And so I would ask that we remember something, and that remember the year 1941. And how can we prevent those 1941 bugs from happening? And the way that I was able to do that is with property-based testing. And so Fred Hubert's book came out this year, and I was really inspired. I had tried to learn property-based testing before and found it to be a really slippery slope. And I would think I had a concept one day, go to bed, and the next day I was down at the bottom of the slope again, and I couldn't remember what I had learned. But I'm glad that the book came out for me when it did, because he has some wonderful sentences throughout the book to encourage you up that slope, even though it is difficult. So property-based testing is describing your system in a set of its most basic properties and testing them. Fuzzing, which is throwing large quantities of data at your tests, and then what you learn from those tests and those failures, you then apply to correcting your system. And here's one of those good quotes, is that property-based testing is a learned and practiced skill. And I'm wondering if anyone here had to learn an instrument as a child? Anyone? Oh, so many. See, this is going to be valid data when I go back to my kids and tell them computer programmers learned an instrument too. Right? But it's that twinkle, twinkle, right? It seems useless and annoying at the time, but it's a way of building, right? So each step. And so I think we can get some twinkle, twinkle value out of stream data. So we're reaching our level of fluency. Yes, it's a slippery slope, but we are going to try to make some progress up that slope. So setting up stream data, it's really simple. It's XUnit properties, right? So we're going to use XUnit properties. And what XUnit properties does, it's sort of it's going to replace some of the XUnit macros with other macros. So in this case, it's check3, and that is executing the arbitrary tests against generated data. And then we have the property3, which replaces the actual test3 macro. So here's an example. So this is how I used some stream data, generated data, to test my CVV input field. So the CVV field is that security number on the back of your credit card. And there's one property about it I know really simply, and that's its length. It's got a minimum of 3, maximum of 4, right? So I thought, okay, I can test this. And stream data, integer, gives me, by default, 100 integers. And then I can check through all of those, check my min and max length, and see if I have a success. So you see here, we start with the property macro and then our check macro. I go ahead and I get the form and I fill it out with the data I already know is valid, but I change that one field to the generated input, and then I submit it. So I'm going to find out here if my length is either success or failure. And one of the hardest parts about property testing, right, is that you can't just replicate what your functions are doing. You have to find a way to make it even simpler, and that's really challenging. In this case, I was lucky I was using kernel and parse in my function, and so here I'm using kernel and digits to sort of make sure that that length is being questioned. But property testing can seem like wizardry, and it can seem like wizardry really fast for me. So I had always wanted to try to create my own generator, but I was a little intimidated, and it's really easy to say you're too busy to do something when life gets going. But I had the privilege of presenting a shorter version of this talk over the summer in the UK at Codebeam London, and somebody afterwards gave me some good feedback and was encouraging me to check out how you make your own generator. And yes, it's sort of stepping onto a slippery part of that slope, but it's like, I can do this. I can go ahead and do it for the benefit of the ElixirConf audience. And so we're going to get into sort of the advanced wizardry here, where the reading gets really fun. But so this was the part that I decided I would try to replace with my own generator. I don't know enough about property-based testing to know if my change is actually of value or not, but it was a good exercise. So I feel I'm still in the spirit of learning. So this bothered me that the logic was in this case statement, so I found a way to remove that by generating a generator. So a generator is a stream data struct, and you can create one with the constant function or combine them to each other with bind. So constant takes a term, and then it always generates that term. Bind is a little more slippery. It accepts data and a function, and it binds each element generated by data to a new generator returned by applying the function. And I really think the only way to understand that is to play with it. So here is what I came up with. I decided to create a generator of good data, good CVVs, because that was really easy. It's just between 100 and 9,999. So I said, I'll create some good CVVs and then bad CVVs. And in this case, with the bad CVVs, I decided to filter out the good ones. There's probably a better way to do that, but I was really trying to focus on the bind, because it's still, sometimes I look at it and it's Greek sometimes, but it's worth going back. And in this case, I end up with a generator of good CVVs and a generator of bad CVVs. And then in my check all, I look for a tuple. So my constant that I output from these identifies whether the data, the element that was generated, is good or bad. And then so I'm returning that tuple. And then the stream data one of allows me to select from either the good or the bad. It's going to select from one of those and return a tuple to me. So I know my tuple is going to be either good or bad. And then instead, my case statement can really simply go, are you good or are you bad? And the generator knows whether it's good or bad. So let's see if it works, shall we? So the first thing, we have to start our WebDriver. Let's see. Yes, thank you. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Better? Is that good? There we go. It's fun, right? Yeah, I first encountered Selenium at a Python conference years ago, and I think I played with it the rest of the conference, and I don't remember any of the other talks. And so we have to go back here and see, yay, we were successful. And we can. So that was integers. How can we talk about strings? Strings baffle me, right? And this was a couple years back. This tweet appeared, and it was that last one that got me laughing to myself, because it is amazing to me what my agents will put into input fields, and I don't know what they were thinking. I don't know why that value was easier than the real value, and so it got to me, and I loved there were follow-up ones that were just as good, and the whole stream that went on from here was hilarious. And it's the one thing that I think is helpful is that we have years of developers who have gone before us and struggled with strings and come up against the troublemakers. And so we can stand on the shoulders of giants when we want to do our property-based string testing. And in this case, the big list of naughty strings is always really helpful. So you get this text file of naughty strings, and you can run your property-based testing against these naughty strings. And here's an example. This is a little excerpt of some of the trouble that can be caused by strings. And I can get a file stream going from this lovely text file, and then I can see stream data member of, grab a member of this wonderful list of naughty strings, and generate a value from that, and then you run whatever validity test you need to run against your strings for business logic or just string valid, and feel really good about yourself. So let's run that one real quick. See if it looked like the size went down again. I will. Because this one, I'm not going to pop the browser. I'm running it headless because Chrome has some trouble with certain strings like emojis. The Chrome just won't even touch them. So we have to run. I did, yeah, I did. I did it, and it fails really in an awful way. So it's, yeah, and it's random, so it will select these random values. And I decided to not show you whether these were passing or failing, so we'll find out at the very end if I caught them all the ones that were going to be problematic. Yay, okay. So we got it. And so my point here today was to just sell you on the benefit of browser automation and give you an example of how it really helped me save a lot of time. And it did. It was in my job, it saved me time. But this was a little icing on the cake because I also identified a problem with the bank's data, which is even more fun than breaking Chrome. It's the bank that will remain nameless gives us these status codes, and they had a duplicate primary key. And my property-based test found it. And we were able to fix it on our side, and I was able to go to my boss and say, see, yeah, property-based testing has a lot of value. So I'm sure there is a level of proficiency out there. I can't see it from where I'm standing, but I'm sure that one day I will be able to. And it does feel like magic. It's an art. But I wanted to leave you with this wonderful quote from the very first software testing conference that was focused on software testing as a thing. Fred Gruenberger said, testing is all art, and it demands a form of low cunning on the part of the programmer. Now, low cunning isn't as used much in the US, but in the UK, it has this wonderful definition that it's being clever but morally bad and dishonest. And if any of you have children, there are moments with your children where you respect the cleverness that went into how they misbehaved. But you have to be the parent. But this idea of low cunning I really love, and I just love that how Boris Bezer says you must be willing to utterly destroy your software as a tester, and I think that's a great thing to keep in mind. And it's coincidence or not, he immigrated to the US in 1941. So the what next is to go forth and destroy. And here's some documentation. The Hound documentation is great. I found it better to actually learn from the tests they wrote themselves to see how they wanted to use their own tools. But if your team is like mine, small and lacking testers, I really believe Hound can save you some time. Thank you. I think we have time for questions.
Front-end testing frameworks in all languages have a reputation for reporting failing tests when actually everything is fine, particularly when they get to the JavaScript level. I was wondering how your experience has been with Hound in terms of that kind of reliability.
No, that's a good point. We had a contractor do some robot framework tests for us, and she warned us that that was a possibility. I haven't come across it in Hound, but it might be because the tests that I've run are not very JavaScript heavy. So I'm testing some Ember apps that are using Ajax, and I haven't run into any trouble there yet, but it's possible. It may be, because it's still relying on Selenium, right? So it's still, if that's its backbone. So it's very possible.
If I understand correctly, for some of these tests, it's generating essentially random data that matches the property descriptions. So does that mean that sometimes your test will succeed and other times you'll find an error that you wouldn't have caught previously?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you see in my constants file, I added some negative numbers, but that was only after I found them using stream data that I was not prepared for negative numbers in the way my code was written. So if for some reason an agent wanted to enter a negative number, it was gonna fail in a poor way.
So is there an art to finding the right number of samples to generate as well?
Oh, that's a good point. Maybe we can go back. That's going to be too small. Anyway, you can, on the tests themselves, you can set what's called max runs, and it defaults to 100. But for my generator that was generating the bad data, I set it to 350 because I wanted more of that. But it's random each time you run it too, so it's almost better the more times you run it. But there's probably an art to finding how many you need for. But I think that's also the challenge, right, of property-based testing is to get your property so basic, so simple, that you can feel more confident with the amount of data you're throwing at it, that you're fuzzing. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. It's been really good.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question regarding the framework you chose for the property testing. So it appears that you guys are using stream data, correct?
Correct.
And one of the books mentioned in your slides, I think, was Proper Testing by Fred.
Yes.
Did you guys kind of look at the trade-offs between using one framework over the other, proper versus stream data?
I did, and stream data was just easier. It was easier for me to use, honestly, and I haven't given up. I haven't given up on learning proper, but I think even my impression from the book so far is that whatever tool is going to work best for you, and whatever framework is going to work best for you, then use it. And yeah, I found stream data, and I was familiar with stream data because we're using it elsewhere, not for this particular problem. But that's a good point. It's a fabulous book if you haven't read it. And I have to take it in small chunks and then reread the small chunks and then reread them and then go on. But I found it really useful. And there's several of the podcast folks who are here have covered it as well. It's really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think the gentleman in the black sweatshirt had his hand up first. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. Just a really basic question. Since you're spinning up the server, can you still take advantage of the active sandbox for each of your tests?
Oh, you can. Yeah, but yes. I have not done it yet, but you can. And there's some, in those optional fields that I was showing you can send to start session, there's a few not so pretty things you have to do in there to get it to work correctly. I believe in the metadata and possibly in the driver as well. There's some great blog posts out there about that. Yeah, I haven't had to tackle that, but yes, you can.
Great,
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question about how does Hound operate in completely headless environments? Like if you were to put it in like a CI/CD pipeline or something like that, and is it like reliable enough in that kind of environment?
Yes, and actually, after the sparkle wore off of seeing that browser pop up all the time after running those hundreds, they were all being run headless. And we're trying to integrate testing with Jenkins at the moment because I would really like, because we're starting to use some contractors, and I would like tests to have to pass before anything is built, and those I want to be headless. And I haven't run into any problems yet. Have you heard anything that they are problematic?
When we were testing it out, we kind of ran into some intermittent hiccups.
Ah,
You mentioned about the timer.
the timer.
earlier. That's probably most of it.
It's that it's even quicker when it's not popping that browser.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, that word art really does apply. That it's an art, not so much a science. Yeah, thank you.
This is the first I've seen of combining property testing and full stack integration browser-based testing. So that is scary to my mind just to be like, want to run all of them, as you're saying. So do you have any thoughts about moving the properties around your stack and trying to maybe get more lower on the stack to be without a browser, perhaps?
Yeah, and I'll give you, you've caught me exactly in the middle of that thought. Because the PHP app I mentioned, I don't think I should admit what version we're running on in production, but we just hired somebody to help us get it up to 7.3, and the changes were drastic, and we have no testing in place, none. And it's all, it's a UI-based system, and that's my only choice is Hound. And I'm putting together the argument right now that it should be me who writes them in Hound as opposed to hiring somebody with another framework experience just because of my business knowledge, right? Because I know how those forms, we don't have to teach someone else how the forms are supposed to be used, and because it's not documented. So that would force us to document all of those and maybe get closer to properties because those seem so far in the distance. We don't even have documented use cases. Because it was a need-based development system, right? Like as soon as somebody needed an application element, we did it, a feature, we did it. So it's poorly documented and not at all tested.
I appreciate the perspective there, the practicality of the browser being.
Yeah, so you're not alone. It's
the level
scary.
of abstraction at which is available.
That's it. And I still don't know that I'm going to win the argument. Right, yeah.
In your talk, you sounded like you let your end-to-end tests hit the external systems. How do you do that? Do you hit the sandbox, and then how do you clean up the data after that?
Oh, that's a really good question. My tiny little DevOps team we have a QA environment, so I'm given a fresh database every time to play it. And that was also a result of coming up against something similar. We realized we couldn't hire a contractor to help us with certain things because we couldn't let them access our database. So we had to, and that wasn't documented, and it got carried away too. So we had to learn our database again and go, how can we create a new one for a contractor? And now the benefit for me has been that I have an actual QA environment where I can test and throw away the data. But you can also, I have several tests in the beginning before that was there, where the test itself in the cleanup would clean up the data. It would go through and delete it all as part of the test. Yeah.
Hi, great presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
I'm curious, does Hound have any helpers in your testing? You mentioned testing to see if a DOM element is available or retrying or sleeping. Does it have any helpers that specifically tell you to wait until that particular DOM element has been rendered?
No, and I don't know why. There must be a reason why, because I don't think Wallaby has them either. Does anyone know? So there must be something, because no, you have to use that, you have to bring in Erlang to get that timer. Yeah, I don't know why that is. Do they take PRs? Say again? I'm assuming so. Yeah, I think so. But I'm assuming. But then I question. I go, there must be a reason that I don't understand why that is, because it would be so valuable. Why? Yeah. Is that it? Anybody else? Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.